I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm the president of the Linnaean Society right now. And I'd just like to welcome you to this Lunchtime Lecture. Our Lunchtime Lecture series is meant to be kind of there with you in your brown bag and accessible to a wide and broad audience. So we're really excited to see this many people here today for this really exciting topic. I'll just introduce the speakers in a minute, but what I'd like to say is those of you who are not fellows of the Society, please do look at joining the Society, because we are, the Linnaean Society is a society about natural history, which is for everyone, not just for practicing academic biodiversity scientists or geologists. It's for everyone. And so I think it's important that we expand our fellowship, and we think about our fellowship in a really inclusive way. So if you aren't a fellow, please do email Padma, email the Society, email us for application forms, and all you need to have to be a fellow is that enthusiasm for natural history, which all of us in the Society have, and I think will be hugely demonstrated today in this lecture. So I'll just briefly introduce the speakers and their projects. Our first speaker will be Andrew Lewis from Cambridge, who is a fellow of the Linnaean Society, I must say, who's going to talk about his project Withymbe. Andrew's an old hand as an IT analyst, and he's been a developer and a program manager since the middle of the 1980s. He's worked at the Home Office and at Royal Mail, and he's recently come through the Masters in Conservation Management program at Cambridge. And in doing that, he's also been looking at developing automated systems for identifying and counting bee species by recording their buzzes. And this is the project first with beeswax since 2012, and now in the project with him. And he's a software development manager at Pembroke College in Cambridge. Again, a person who is not necessarily doing biology or natural history in academia, but is a passionate natural historian and is bringing all of his expertise to understanding the world around us. The other project that we'll be talking about is called Dhvani, which is the Sanskrit word for sound. And that's what this project is all about. The project utilizes emerging technology of acoustics to measure and monitor vocalizing biodiversity across a huge spectrum from insects to amphibians, birds, and mammals. And the project was co-founded by 3 Ph.D. researchers in India, Pooja Choksi, Sarika Khanwilkar, and Vijay Ramesh. Pooja and Sarika are working in central India, and Vijay in the area of the Western Ghats. And today, Vijay will be presenting the project to us. And I think one of the great things about this particular event for us is we're bringing together people who are actually doing similar things, but thousands and thousands of miles apart. And what's fantastic about these virtual events is we can actually do this now, which was really difficult to do in the past. And so I'm really excited to have both Vijay, Andrew, Pooja, and Sarika with us here on the panel, and for you to kind of put your questions in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll get a really good discussion going. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and thank you very much for you attendees for coming to this Linnaean Society Lunchtime Lecture. Thanks very much.
Welcome to Project, it's pronounced Withymbe. The word comes from the Anglo-Saxon for following the bees. And basically I've got a story to tell you, which I'd like to tell you to the backdrop of the concept diagram for the project. Basically, John Barleycorn farms 100 hectares of arable crops and mixed industry in the east of England. He is applying for biodiversity-based environmental grants under new UK agriculture legislation. He is introducing wildflower margins along his fields and needs to monitor the flora and pollinators to qualify. Until now, the methods of monitoring were entirely human-based, using transects and spot counts along the line suggested by Carvel 2016 and the POMS pollinator monitoring scheme. This means reliance on a natural distribution of scarce identification skills. This scarcity and uneven distribution means some regions may struggle for access to counting resources. No longer. Fortunately, we now have Project Withymbe, an automatic counting system, which means the identification of key bee species is no longer dependent upon scarce skills and can be implemented by any competent volunteer. John Barleycorn contracts a supplier of Withymbe technology to count the abundance of key species on his farms along transects and spot counts similar to the human counters, operating on parts which are remote and difficult to reach. John then submits the Withymbe results with his application for funding for environmental stewardship. As a result of measurable monitoring statistics, the application for environmental funding is successful, and John can invest further in sustainable farming techniques. This little fictitious story illustrates the needs and benefits of automatic bee counting. What I'd like to show you, you can see on the concept diagram there, this was the initial concept from a beeswax 7 derivative. And it shows that we initially wanted to place intelligent IoT projects out in the field to monitor via microphones the buzzes of the individual bees. What I'll now do is move on to the main slide. Here is the main slide, and I'll go around it from right round clockwise, around from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I've just read the story, John Barleycorn, and that gives you the scenario which we're expecting to move into. The need came from a meeting in UK Parliament back in about 2016, when an unnamed scientist at the meeting in Parliament suggested that we cannot count the bees sufficiently. And at that time, the National Pollinator Strategy was being formulated. So I came away from the meeting with a need which I couldn't fulfill because the technology wasn't available. Now, the issue is environmental land management. It's about farmers and stewardship of the land. They get grants in the UK for building in biodiversity friendly policies. And the issue was time. The issue now is timing. The transit through Parliament of the legislation is dependent upon the parliamentary time, and that's being delayed by Brexit, COVID, and the DEFRA consultation was delayed and then closed in August this year. The issue that we face for the need is the granularity of monitoring. What hasn't been decided by government yet is what level of analysis they need for biodiversity monitoring, whether it will be done at the species level or at the family level on a farm. Now, I'll jump onto the science of it. Carvel uses transects and point counts. He's very clear about that. That's as a given, and we're hoping to mimic that by augmenting the human counters by automatic systems. There's a current state, is the pollinator monitoring system, which you can see there, and they use human counters. Now, as a result of the UK Parliament decision, the comment that they couldn't count the bees sufficiently, about 2 years ago, some technology came on the market which enabled us to think about using Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is a mechanism by which you can build fog nodes which capture data and pass it up through the cloud into the system. And we built a node successfully with a Raspberry Pi with a radio hat on it that broadcasts 2 kilometers from a nearby stately home to my house, line of sight. And it was a successful broadcast end to end. It used the mic, it broadcast the information from the Raspberry Pi all the way up to the cloud Dynamo database in the cloud on AWS. This is an earlier concept version. And then what came along was some more. The trouble with this was it's not very robust. It's a Raspberry Pi program. We would have to put it in a box. We'd have to make the microphone external. There were technical shortcomings, but the breakthrough was the software development. What it meant was that we developed the bee software subsequently to identify the bees, and that's where Withymbe came along. What we found was that we could use audio moths, which I'll show you, instead of a Raspberry Pi, to record the buzzes of the bees. And that's the key issue. The bees' buzzes, because of their physiological differences, we believe, make a different spectrum of buzz depending on the species. There is some overlap, but we're not entirely clear whether that's significant within the processing or not. But basically, the bee's buzz distinguishes the species of bee within size parameters. Now, we developed a timing mechanism for the audio moth to place them on farms, and we tested it this summer with 7 species that we agreed with the University of Reading to develop. And we now have we use digital signal processing to do it. The actual program, Withymbe program, uses a comparison of spectrums using DSP of 7 species of bee against target systems. And we use a Pearson correlation to decide whether it's like or not. This has the advantage over machine learning of not having to have 100,000 training recordings. They just didn't exist. We only have one. Recordings of bees are very few and far between. And so we had to go to the British Library to get recordings of the bee species we were after. We only have the 1 recordings, but this system allows us to match them. We tested it this summer and we are very confident about the results. We do believe we have a system which is robust and does distinguish and counts properly. Okay. I think that's as much as I need to say about that. The system is in testing. We intend to go forward with Professor Potts from the University of Reading in the spring next year. I shall be going to a local reserve at Finchingfield and placing 10 audio moths out there to garner different recordings of different clans of bees, as opposed to, or different hives of bees, as opposed to the single set we've looked at already. And we should be testing the veracity of our theory as to whether we can gather the information on a farm. And that's what we intend to do. We're going to field proof it. And I think that's about it, really. Thank you very much indeed.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. Vijay, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes, I'll go ahead now. It says only host. Yeah, I should be able to share screen now. One sec.
Great.
Share computer sound. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Padma, for having us here, and the Linnean Society for hosting us. I'm Vijay Ramesh, a Ph.D. student at Columbia University and a co-founder of Project Dhvani. Before I tell you a bit more about Project Dhvani, I thought I'll play 2 audio clips and take you to the heart of Central India. And I wanted to interact with all of you, but maybe you can just think about what's the first thing that comes to your mind as you listen to these 2 clips. So I'm going to go ahead and play these 2 clips for you. So that's the first one. I'm going to play the second one now. Okay, I'm glad all of you have heard these 2 clips. If you, like me, have a keen ear to some of these sounds, you would think that there's a clear difference in terms of the 2 clips that I played for you. Right? So if you had no idea about where these clips are coming from, you would think that, okay, you know what, these 2 clips are coming from a forested site, somewhere close to where there's a lot of greenery, etc. Well, the first clip that I played for you is actually coming from unrestored or a degraded sort of like a forest patch in central India. In fact, in the foreground, you can actually see thorny lantana, which is an invasive scrub. And the second clip that I played for you is actually coming from an actively restored forest site. This is just a preliminary data. We haven't analyzed this in detail, but you can clearly see that there's a clear acoustic difference between these two different sites, right? But before we talk a bit more about these differences, I'm going to make an argument for why use acoustics in the first place. Especially in a tropical country like India, where a large proportion of the biodiversity is heard, but often not seen, it makes sense that we use it makes sense that we use a tool which can reduce our effort while at the same time sample large swathes of rainforests and sites. Right? In fact, in the Western Ghats, where I carry out majority of my research, over 90% of the birds that we document are often heard by ear. Right? So it makes sense that we use a tool that can reduce our manual effort while at the same time sample large swathes of sites, rainforests, etc. Right? The second case I want to make here, or the second argument for why acoustics, and more importantly, why acoustics, is because today habitat loss is a key concern. Right? And we need tools that can rapidly monitor deforestation and aid conservation. While technologies like satellite imagery can provide a picture of what's happening on the ground, it doesn't tell us a lot about how biodiversity is responding to these environmental changes. And acoustics can be one such tool that can be used as a conservation tool. Right? So in fact, this is a picture I wanted to show you, an image on the right side that you can see. Sorry, the screenshot that you can see is from this paper where the authors have essentially been recording sounds from a site in Borneo. And the image you can see here is what we call as a spectrogram, which gives you a visual sense of the overall acoustic activity at a given site. And a soundscape is nothing but the sum total of all the sounds of a given landscape, so to say. So imagine having an idea of the acoustics at a given site and recording the same, placing a record at the same site over and over and over again across years. That gives you a sense of what's happening in terms of what's happening to, or rather gives you a sense of how biodiversity is responding to changes over time at a given site. In fact, this can be carried out by looking at it across a wider space. Imagine being able to deploy recorders across Southeast Asia and thinking about how acoustics varies in geographic space. In fact, what if a species is vocalizing at a particular site, but that species is not detected at another site? Is it because the species is not found there? Or is it because there's something about that site that the species is not vocalizing? So these are questions that we're just scratching the surface in terms of using acoustics as a tool for conservation. Right? And the last point being that climate change is also a key factor. And with climatic changes, we need a tool that can rapidly assist conservation and help us get a sense of how species are adapting to these changes. And it's often not clear with certain technologies like satellite imagery or camera trapping, for example. Right? So with this in mind, the three of us decided to start Project Dhvani in 2018 as PhD students at the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology at Columbia University. Pooja and Sarika primarily carry out their work in Central India. I'll tell you a bit more about that. And I mostly work in the Western Ghats. Our site will go live later in January of this year, and you can zoom into our sites, get a sense of the biodiversity at different sites in Central India and the Western Ghats. So where do we work? As I mentioned earlier, we work primarily in Central India and the Western Ghats. Central India mostly being the humid dry forests of Central India, and in the Western Ghats being wet evergreen forests of the Western Ghats. And how do we go about doing this? Actually, before I tell you about how we go about in doing this, let me give you a flavor of our site. So at Project Dhvani, we're keen to monitor biodiversity across human modified landscapes of India, right? So this is just to give you a flavor of what our sites look like. On the left top corner is a benchmark or so to say a pristine protected area site. And in fact, in the right top corner, you can see what we call as a degraded site. You might say, hey, this looks pretty green to me. Why are you calling it degraded? Well, All the green you can see at the forefront is in fact the lantana shrub that's flowering, which takes away a lot of resources from native species. And in the bottom two panels, you can see a restored forest site, which is being actively restored by some of our project partners. And in the left bottom corner, you can see an unrestored site, or a site that is naturally regenerating or abandoned for regeneration, right? So how do we go about doing this? We've been speaking about acoustics for a while. So let me show you our recorders. That's Pooja holding two different recorders that we use in our study. The recorder on the left is a Swift recorder, a rather large recorder, but which also means that it can capture sounds from a much wider radius. On the right is an audio moth, which should be familiar to most of you in the UK, because it's in fact it's coming from the UK, and it's currently being used globally for a large number of studies related to acoustics. And the advantage of using a small piece like the audio moth is that I can go to a large number of sites in a given day, place these recorders, and then come back and move on to a couple of other sites the next day. Right? So we place these recorders in our field sites, we set them up for recording sounds for long periods of time, and then what do we do next? Here you can see Sarika transferring a lot of these data to laptops, and that's something we'll talk about later, which is these recorders generate a ton of data, and managing them is a bit of an issue. But we transfer all these data from these SD cards and memory cards to our laptops and hard drives, and then we begin the process of analyzing this acoustic data. So I'm going to give you a small sneak peek of analysis. So at the moment, we have over 44 sites in the Western Ghats. And last summer, I was fortunate to have been stuck at some of my sites during the nationwide lockdown in India. And we placed these audio mods for 7 to 15 days of continuous recording at each site. And we'll continue this process of data collection later in winter as well. So just to remind you a bit more about what our sites look like, we have a gradient of natural regeneration. So some of our sites are actively restored by our project partners. Some of our sites that you can see in the center are naturally regenerating sites. So these are sites that have been abandoned for regeneration. And on the right, you can see a protected area site, which is our control or a benchmark site, right? In the center there, that's a gaur, which is a famous gaur close to a base camp. He loves to wander around that site in particular. Anyway, this is the only data heavy slide I'm going to show you now, and it's interesting. This is a preliminary result, but what's interesting here is that we went through all our audio data, and we started to make a count of all the species of birds that we can hear at different sites, right? So on the bottom panel, you can see sites that are actively restored. In the center, you can see benchmark sites. And in the right, and to my right, you can see these passively restored or naturally regenerating sites, right? So what we did, my colleagues and I, is that we decided to split our species, bird species, as those species that favor open country versus those species that favor or are predominantly found in rainforest sites. And the first thing you might notice here is that the Malabar trogon, which is a representation of the health of a rainforest, and if a Malabar trogon is found in one of our rainforest sites, it suggests that the site is pretty healthy. And what's really intuitive and something that we expected is that a lot of rainforest birds are being detected in our protected area sites or our benchmark sites, which is shown in the graph here, right? But what's really encouraging to us and our project partners is that we are seeing a large number of rainforest birds being detected in our actively restored forest sites, which goes to say that, active restoration is in fact having a positive impact on rainforest bird communities. Right? This is, of course, just a preliminary result. We're yet to run measures of significance and try to ask if in fact these results are significant. But from an exploratory standpoint, we feel like this is encouraging to us to carry on this project for longer periods of time to ask how active restoration might impact bird communities in the Western Ghats and Central India. And the other bird that I forgot to point out here is the red-whiskered bulbul, which commonly occurs in open country habitats in India. Right? And the next steps is that at each of our sites, we in fact take a lot of vegetation measurements. We want to get a sense of how the structure of the vegetation at each of our sites impacts the acoustic data we collect, but also how does the vegetation structure really impact faunal biodiversity like birds, insects, mammals, etc. Right? So that's something that's being carried out at the moment. And lastly, before I wrap up, I just wanted to briefly mention a few long-term conservation goals for Project Dhvani. Right? And something that we have been trying to do is monitor acoustic diversity across these human-modified landscapes of India. And another thing that we hope to do, something along the lines of what Andrew mentioned, is carry out automated detection of birds, which is species-specific identification of birds. But we're also working with a few academic partners in developing a system that can monitor illegal activity within these protected areas. So in fact, we have a large database of sounds that are being annotated that can tell you if the sound you heard is in fact that of that of logging being carried out, or is it a gunshot, etc. And we hope to feed this into an artificial intelligence or a AI deep learning framework that can then be used by the folks who actually do conservation work, which is officials of the forest department and communities around these protected areas. And they can then help them, monitor some of these crucial sites for a large proportion of biodiversity in India. And with that, I wanted to thank our partners, the Tamil Nadu and Madhya Pradesh forest departments, our project partners, and most importantly, communities around these tiger reserves and national parks who have given us the opportunity to carry out this work here. And of course, our advisors at Columbia, Ruth de Vries. And thank you, Padma and the Linnean Society for hosting us, and funding partners for helping us carry out this project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vijay, and thanks a lot, Andrew. So we have a few questions. There's a question, Vijay and Pooja, to you. How long have the recorders been used to study these sites?
Pooja, do you want to take that, or should I answer these questions? We can split them. I think Pooja's audio is...
I think Vijay, probably you might want to take it because I think your internet is a bit...
Yeah. So at the moment, we've been deploying it for... sorry, yeah, Pooja, I think there's a lag. I was just adding that at the moment, we've been deploying it for 7 days at a stretch. And we would like to, deploy these recorders for longer periods of time, at least month at a stretch or 2 months at a stretch, etc. But given the resources we have in terms of battery use and the effort it takes to go replace these memory cards, we've been deploying for a week at a time at each of our sites.
Yeah. Right. Andrew, there's a question for you. Is the audio moth setup straightforward enough that schools and families could pop one into their gardens and monitor bees for a citizen science project, or do they also need a fairly complicated radio ham type of setup?
No, they're quite
Might be harder.
They are quite straightforward. It's you do need a program, a computer program, which you can download. It's a freeware program. It allows you to sequence the timings, so you can set it to come on at lunchtime and go off at 4. It's absolutely ideal for home citizen science. It really is. It's a very good bit of kit. It lasts. The batteries should last about 3 days. That's 72 hours, I guess. And it's very simple to use. As I say, we've got 10 to go out next spring. But I can see no problem with schools using it, or anybody. A sixth form, fifth, the upper grades of the school will probably be able to handle it with no problem at all.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I'm pretty sure kids would love. I mean, I don't know how difficult it is to tell the difference between the buzzers. It would have been nice to hear, but do you think it's pretty straightforward to differentiate?
The buzzes themselves is not much to hear, to be honest with you. It's the buzz of the bee. also the excuse me, the actual sequence we use is very small amount of a very small amount, because we're looking at the spectrum. We're not looking at the recording itself. We actually use FFT to look at the recording spectrum. So we're identifying spectrums, not actual waveform. So I think they could use it straightforwardly. The software itself is packageable. We could ship it out. Yes, we can do a citizen science thing, and that's not a problem.
Question for you, Pooja and Vijay, from Gina. Do you have any access to historical records for biodiversity on any of your research sites? I'm guessing you do.
Yeah, we do actually. At least, I mean, in the Western Ghats, at least we've been collecting some, or rather documenting a lot of this historical data from these sites. That goes all the way back to 1870s, etc. Yeah.
Can you give an example of like what kind of historical records you have been using?
So these are not, of course, these are not acoustic, but these range from museum specimens to literature, journal literature. So there've been published records in journals like Stray Feathers or the Journal of the Bombay Natural History Society, which just document that a bird species was seen here and a bird species was seen at location Y, etc.
Right. Question from Brian Cresswell to Andrew.
Yes.
There are more than 7 bee species. So can I distinguish known from the unknown?
Yes, it does. What we did was we in liaison with Reading University, Professor Potts, we went through and identified the key mainstream species that have been identified as key, if you like, keystone species of bees in the UK. And I can give you the main 3: Bombus terrestris, Bombus pretorum, and Apis mellifera. Of the 3 main species, there are 2 mining bees and 2 other bees that come from the Adrena family. We have initially, funnily enough, we were looking to identify hoverflies as well as a broader spectrum. So yes, we only pick up the 7 species we're looking for. It does isolate out, and it also deduplicates. That means that if a bee loiters around or revisits, as they do on a pattern of 2 hours, if it revisits the recorder, the program takes that second visit out, so we don't overcount. So there are some subtleties in the counting system that allow for specific targeting of the species we're looking for. But as I say, we were looking to do hoverflies, but we found that their buzz is too quiet for the recorder. They only have 1 wing, and the bees have 4. So do we?
I see. Vijay, a question for you from Anna Cord. How did you analyze the data, the results shown in the box plots? She said that they used BirdNet CNN, which worked quite well.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So at the moment, what we've been doing is our project students, interns, and the 3 of us have been listening to a lot of these recordings and manually annotating them. So it takes a lot of effort to go through them and pinpoint what bird species are calling. Was there any human noise heard? Were there insects heard, etc.? And the aim is to feed it into a neural network or an AI framework. Unfortunately, we don't have a BirdNet CNN for India, mostly because tropical forest sounds are far more complex to analyze in an AI framework relative to temperate bird species. But that's the aim in the near future. Yeah.
Okay. Andrew, Anna has a nice comment for you regarding citizen science. A collaborator of hers shipped audio moths to farmers in the UK during the lockdown, and that worked very well.
That's very good. That's very encouraging, and I greatly appreciate that comment, because it's there are relatively new bits of technology as far as we understand. Also, it's an issue to get to liaise with the farmers. There's a bit of handshaking needs to go on to get them implemented. So I'm glad that worked fine. That's great. Thank you.
There's a question from Manideep Mandal. In fact, I'm going to add to that question, a question that I had myself. He is asking, what's a good number of recorders that could be used in a given area of the forest? And I was also curious to know, I mean, compared to camera traps, I'm assuming this catchment area is much larger. So in terms of biodiversity monitoring, say, let's say a tea plantation wants to monitor if it's, improving or going down. I mean, would you say that then this is better than camera traps?
I mean, okay, well, I want to start by saying it really depends on the question we're trying to ask, like you said, right? Like whether we want to get at, if we want to document, say, large mammal species, I suppose a camera trap is much better because they vocalize far lesser compared to birds or insects. And number of recorders in a given area, it really depends on A, yeah, the question again, and B, the recorder you're using. Audio moth, for example, in a tea plantation can record sounds up to 100-meter radius. But the same audio moth, if you take it to a rainforest adjoining it, it can probably record sounds only within a 70-meter radius, or even lesser. And it really depends on the structure of the site as well. So yeah, I really think it depends on the question. Yeah.
Okay. Chris Hales has a question. I don't know who this is for, but maybe you can decide. He's asking, how do you use your sounds database to analyze your recordings, and how automated is it? I'm assuming, Vijay, it's for you because it's a sounds database. Or
Okay.
Andrew also talked about sounds database. And I was curious as to, you said that the British Museum had one recording.
Well, of each species that we went for, yes.
Yeah, and if you think that, we should be having soundscapes, I'm guessing, as natural, I mean, will be history at some point. So, should we be having soundscape as natural history specimens, if you want to call it so?
I think so. I think I've got a parabolic mic, which I've been using to try and take recordings in the live field to make the recordings. We actually we just have the data as a processed WAV file. For the technical people, it's .wavs, WAV files are the raw data. And we then process those through a program written in Python, which then gives us the FFT, the fast Fourier transform. We then aggregate those and perform functions on them to get a mean, which is we use the aggregated mean of a number of recording slices to give us the baseline for our comparison. So in fact, it's held in a spreadsheet.
Vijay, do you have anything to add to that, as in how automated is your process?
At the moment, it's definitely not automated as we expect it to be. I mean, I think we keep saying that acoustics or audio soundscape ecology is like a rapid monitoring tool, but in fact, at least in the initial aspects, it needs a lot of manual effort. Like at the moment, we're just, as I mentioned earlier, we're just going through a lot of these recordings and manually annotating ones and zeros in a spreadsheet. But the hope is to have something like, like a BirdNet or like a neural network that's been developed for North America and Europe for India but it's just that we don't have a large database yet for tropical bird sounds. I mean, we have like open access databases like Xenocanto, etc., but they have very, very few sounds. Or even the Macaulay library that Cornell hosts, they don't have as many sounds as we would need for a deep learning framework.
And just to finish off, I think Anna has one last comment. As part of the German national data infrastructure, they're planning to set up an open repository for soundscape data as archive and to develop benchmarks. And she will get in touch with all of you once they're there. So that's nice to know. Thank you, everyone, for being here during your lunchtime. And as you know, all these projects are developing, and do keep an eye out on how they progress. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Padma.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.